I had just crawled back from the edge of the grave, the bitter trace of antiseptic and oxygen still burning in my lungs. That night inside my $20 million estate, I wanted nothing more than to lie down and sleep, my body weak and tired, but my dog refused to stay quiet. He tugged at the leash until I followed, almost as if he knew something I did not. The grass was wet, the night so still it felt like the world was holding its breath, and then I saw it. By the shed stood Hannah, my daughter-in-law, leaning close to the new gardener. Their faces were almost touching, their fingers brushed together like secret lovers who thought no one was watching. My chest tightened, not from sickness but from fury, because I knew at once this was no small betrayal. It was a scheme growing like poison in my own home, and the danger reached far beyond a broken marriage vow. It threatened the very heart of my fortune. If you are here, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and say hello to me in the comments. Let me know where you are from. And now let me tell you the story of my life. I am a 60-year-old woman, a widow, who carries both the weight of loss and the sharp memory of everything my late husband and I built together. My home is a $20 million estate, nestled in the wealthy outskirts of New Jersey, a place where the gates are tall and the neighbors live behind hedges as old as their fortunes. Inside these walls, I walk past treasures that remind me of him, each one chosen with care. 19th-century European paintings line the hallways, their frames gilded, heavy with history. Delicate Asian vases sit beneath them, their porcelain faces telling stories older than my bloodline. The carved wooden furniture glimmers with inlays of jade and pearl, each piece insured, catalogued, and protected within the addendum of my will. This was not just a house, it was a museum of our lives together, and a fortress for the legacy he left in my care. Yet beauty draws hunger, as flame calls moths. Hannah, my son's wife, walked into this house with her pretty smile and honeyed words, but I soon understood her heartbeat not for family, but for status. She wore luxury like a second skin, not earned but borrowed, desperate to make my fortune her shortcut into the high life. To Dylan, she was sweetness itself, but to me, she was a reminder that wealth can invite envy, and that behind the silk of her voice, there lurked ambition sharp enough to cut. I watched her eyes linger too long on the paintings, her hands touch the carved edges of the furniture, as if she were testing ownership, and I knew then that I had become her sweetest target. Dylan is my only son, 30 years old, and from the day he was born I thought I would always be his compass, the voice he trusted above all. Now he runs his own company, an adventure travel business that sends him across oceans and mountains, chasing contracts and building partnerships. His life is fast, busy, and full of risk. Yet when he found Hannah, he believed he had finally discovered an anchor. He married her quickly, swept away by her beauty and soft words, and because he loved her so deeply, he handed her more than his heart. He handed her me. Not long after their wedding, I suffered a mild stroke, and when I returned home from the hospital, frail and unsteady, a nurse was hired to care for me day to day. Yet Dylan placed the greater responsibility in Hannah's hands, believing she would treat me as a daughter would treat her own mother. He told me more than once that I should rest and let Hannah take care of everything, as if her presence was a blessing. I smiled for his sake, but inside I felt a shadow fall across my place in his life. Because Dylan traveled so often, Hannah became the manager of the estate by default. She controlled the household accounts, she decided what bills were paid, and she filtered every message that reached my son. When I asked Dylan why I had not heard from him for weeks, he said Hannah told him I was resting, too weak to take calls. Each lie wrapped itself around me like another rope, and slowly I felt myself being pushed out of the circle of his trust. It was a quiet pain, one only a mother could know. To watch my son believe in a woman's sweetness while I tasted the bitterness of her ambition. She held the keys to the house, the finances, and to my son's attention. I, the mother who once guided him through every storm, was treated as a frail patient on the sidelines. My heart ached not from the stroke, but from seeing my place taken by hands that only clutched for wealth. Hannah wore her mask with the skill of an actress, And before Dylan and his circle of friends, she played the role to perfection. She would glide into the living room with a tray of tea, smiling sweetly as she bent to lift me gently from the chair, whispering that my comfort was her only concern. To outsiders, she looked like a model daughter-in-law, the kind every man prays his mother will adore, and Dylan was blinded by it. He saw her tender gestures, heard her soft voice calling me her priority, and he believed. I sat in silence, nodding, knowing the act was meant for him, not for me. When the doors closed and the visitors left, the sweetness turned sour. Hannah's eyes hardened, her words sharpened like knives. She would hiss under her breath that I was a useless old woman, a weight she was forced to carry. My meals arrived on cheap plastic trays, reheated food that tasted of nothing, while she slipped out at night in gowns bought with money Dylan wired home. I discovered that the pills I was supposed to take had been switched to generic substitutes, saving her money that she poured into handbags, shoes, and designer coats. My body grew stronger each day, but she wanted the illusion of weakness to remain, because weakness gave her power. The worst betrayal came not with the food or the medicine, but with the lies she fed to Dylan. She controlled every phone call, every email, telling him I was too tired, too fragile, too sick to speak. She sent him carefully staged photographs, me in a blanket with a cup of tea, her hand resting on my shoulder, an image of devotion. He praised her for her devotion, never realizing that she built her halo from deception. The truth was that my son was being locked out of his mother's reality, his vision clouded by her careful manipulation. In those moments, staring at the walls of my own home, I felt a pain far worse than the stroke. It was the fear of every mother to be stripped of her voice, to have her bond with her child poisoned by someone who only wanted access to wealth. I watched Hannah pose in mirrors, snapping pictures of herself draped in silk, while she let me fade into the background like old furniture. She thought she had silenced me, but in my silence I was gathering strength, waiting for the moment to remind her that even an old woman has claws. After the mild stroke, I let my body appear fragile, my steps slow, my hands trembling as if I could hardly hold a spoon. I learned quickly that Hannah was less careful when she thought I was too weak to notice, so I wore weakness like a cloak. I let her think she had me under her control, trapped in my chair, blind to her schemes. Yet when she left the house, I worked quietly with the nurse, following every bit of the diet plan she gave me, eating the foods that healed instead of the scraps Hannah set before me. I bought my own medication through discreet deliveries, replacing the diluted pills Hannah slipped onto my tray. Each pill I took on my own terms, each bite of real nourishment, brought strength back into my veins. When the halls of the house were empty, I rose from my chair and began to walk again. First from one side of the room to the other, then down the corridor with my hand against the wall. At night, when Hannah was away spending Dylan's money, I stretched. I practiced the exercises the doctor had prescribed, and I felt my body respond with a will that surprised even me. The more she wanted me to remain a helpless invalid, the more determined I became to rise from that image. Each day I let her insults wash over me, every cheap meal and every sneer she threw in private. I stayed quiet, but I watched. I noted the way she counted cash before leaving the house, the way she returned smelling of perfume not her own, the way her eyes darted with greed at the sight of the paintings on the walls. I became a silent witness, and in my silence I was gathering proof. I was no longer the fragile widow she believed me to be. I was a soldier, moving in secret, building strength beneath the mask of sickness. Each step I took, each piece of knowledge I stored away, was a weapon waiting to be used. Hannah thought she had silenced me, thought she had taken control of this house and my son's loyalty. She could not see that behind the facade of frailty, I was sharpening my claws, waiting for the moment to turn her own arrogance against her. One morning I moved slowly through the long gallery of my home, the sunlight falling across the polished floor like strips of gold. I had walked this corridor 1,000 times, my hand brushing the familiar walls where my husband's treasures had always kept me company. That morning my steps faltered. A space yawned empty where a painting once hung, a 19th century oil piece my husband had fought to win at auction. I remembered the look of pride in his eyes when it was carried into the house years ago, the way he said it would outlive us both. Now there was only a pale rectangle on the wall, an outline where the frame had been. My chest tightened with a grief that burned, sharper than any illness, sharper than the stroke. I hurried as much as my legs allowed and entered the grand hall. The vases were gone too. Porcelain from the 18th century, once resting proudly on carved pedestals, had vanished without a trace. The sconce lights glared against the empty spaces where they had always stood. My breath caught and my hands shook, not from weakness this time, but from fury. How dare anyone touch the legacy of my husband, the legacy that I was sworn to protect? Each piece was listed in the insurance records, catalogued and appraised, tied to his name and mine. The absence was more than theft, it was desecration. My mind raced with questions. Had someone broken in? Had the alarms failed? Or had this been done from inside, by someone who believed I was too blind or too weak to notice? My heart told me the answer before my mind dared to. Hannah. I thought of the way her eyes lingered on the paintings, the careless way her fingers brushed the frames as though she was testing possession. I thought of her expensive shoes lined at the door, of the dresses still smelling of the boutiques where Dylan's money had been spent. I stood in the silent hall, the walls staring back at me, and I felt grief harden into anger. I whispered his name, my late husband, as if he could hear me, as if I were promising him that I would not let our treasures vanish without a fight. The house felt different now, not safe, not sacred, but infiltrated. The missing paintings and vases were not just signs of loss. They were proof that betrayal had moved into these walls, breathing the same air I breathed. The morning after I discovered the empty spaces in the gallery, I called for the housekeeper. He had served this family for more than 20 years, loyal and steady, the kind of man who knew every creak of the floor and every secret of the staff. When he entered the hall and saw me standing before the blank wall, his face grew pale. I asked where the painting had gone, and his hands trembled as he wiped sweat from his brow. He whispered that my daughter-in-law said the items were lent to a friend just for a little while. The words fell from his mouth without conviction, like a line rehearsed under pressure. I studied him carefully. His shoulders were tense, his eyes darted to the door as if he feared someone might be listening. Hannah kept her grip on all of them through wages, through the small privileges she controlled each day. I could see it now. He dared not speak against her openly, yet his eyes told me the truth he could not put into words. They begged me to understand that the explanation was false, that what had been taken might never return. My mind turned to the documents I knew so well, the insurance records listing every artifact, every piece catalogued with photographs and valuations. In the United States, fine art and antiques cannot be lent or moved without notice, without paperwork filed through the insurers. A loan without process was not a loan at all. It was theft disguised, or worse, a quiet transaction meant to bleed my estate under the cover of secrecy. I felt my jaw tighten, my pulse steady into something colder than fear. The housekeeper's sweat, his careful silence, his unwillingness to meet my gaze, all of it spoke louder than confession. This was no misunderstanding. This was the first crack in a wall of deception, and I could feel the weight of danger pressing in from within my own home. The pieces that vanished were not lost to strangers in the night. They were taken by hands that walked these halls in daylight, protected by my son's trust, and emboldened by my supposed weakness. I made the decision quietly, signing the papers myself, and within a day a licensed technician arrived to install cameras throughout the estate. I placed them only in the public areas, where the law was clear and my right as the owner was unquestionable. One in the grand living room, one in the hallway that led to the bedrooms, another in the kitchen, and one at the front gate. They were discreet, almost invisible, and yet sharp enough to capture every detail. I felt a strange calm when the red lights blinked on, as though the walls of my home had finally been given eyes to see what I had long suspected. It took only a few nights for the truth to come rushing in. At 2 in the morning, when the rest of the house was silent, The cameras showed Hannah gliding through the door in a glittering evening gown, her heels clicking against the marble floor. In her arms were bags from the most expensive boutiques, bright logos stamped across the glossy paper. Her hair was still pinned from a party, her face glowing with the residue of champagne and perfume. She did not creep in with guilt. She floated with confidence, as though the estate was hers and mine was nothing more than a shadow in the corner. The footage revealed more than her late arrivals. In the morning light, I saw the shopping bags torn open and discarded, boxes stacked along the hallway, designer shoes lined up carelessly in the living room. New dresses, still wrapped in tissue paper, were left on the sofa, as if the house itself were nothing but her dressing room. It was not the behavior of a caretaker or a dutiful wife. It was the arrogance of someone who believed she had already claimed the throne. Watching the recordings, my heart hardened. Each image stripped away the last excuse I might have offered her. I was not imagining cruelty. I was not exaggerating neglect. The evidence glared at me in high definition. She paraded through my home like a conqueror, while I, the rightful mistress of the estate, was treated as a burden too feeble to matter. In those hours, staring at the glowing screen, I felt the full weight of betrayal, but I also felt the spark of something else. I was gathering the truth piece by piece, and when the time came, it would be Hannah herself who would be trapped by her own reflection in the eyes of my house. The next piece of the puzzle came not from whispers in the dark, but from the cold numbers on paper. I asked the bank to send me a copy of the joint account statements, the account Dylan faithfully wired money into each month to cover the household. As I unfolded the pages, my hands tightened because the truth stared back at me in black ink. Thousands upon thousands withdrawn in single days, transactions scattered across boutiques on Fifth Avenue, luxury clubs in Manhattan, restaurants where a single bottle of wine cost more than a nurse's monthly salary. The account bled money as though someone had cut it open with a knife. I traced each line with my finger, and there her name appeared again and again. Hannah had even signed for deliveries as Mrs. Dillon, a title she wielded like a weapon, scrawled across receipts for handbags, jewelry, and shoes. I had seen the boxes piled in the hallway, but now I had proof that they were purchased not with her earnings, but with my son's trust. She was not just living richly, she was laundering greed into legitimacy, pretending her extravagance was the natural privilege of a wife. The law was clear in my mind. In America, marriage creates a shared estate, but it does not give one spouse the right to destroy that estate for personal indulgence. The term echoed in my head like a bell: marital waste. Using marital funds to benefit a lover, to indulge in luxuries that drained the account, to strip wealth from the family without consent. This was not merely selfishness, it was a violation. Every handbag, every receipt, was another piece of evidence that her spending was not just immoral, but unlawful. I closed the folder slowly, breathing through the fury that threatened to shake me. The insult had grown far beyond her cruel words and her cheap food. It had climbed into the realm of the courts, into the eyes of lawyers and judges who would recognize the damage she was doing. This was no longer about a bitter daughter-in-law mocking her mother-in-law. This was about theft wrapped in silks, about fraud disguised as love. I knew then that my fight would not only be personal. It would be legal, it would be public, and it would be Hannah's ruin. It was close to midnight when I finally let myself sink into the silence of my room, ready to rest after another long day of pretending to be weak. My dog, usually calm at this hour, began to bark with a sharpness that made my skin prickle. He clawed at the door, restless, his body pulling with urgency until I gave in and followed him into the garden. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of wet grass, and the estate lay in shadows under a thin slice of moon. I tightened my shawl around my shoulders, my heart uneasy with every step. Near the shed, the barking stopped, replaced by a quiet so sharp I could hear my own pulse. I froze when I saw them. Hannah stood close to the gardener, their faces nearly touching, their voices nothing more than whispers carried by the night. I could not catch the words, but I did not need to. Their hands brushed, lingered, then clasped for a fleeting second before springing apart like guilty children. Their eyes darted around, watchful, before they broke apart, their bodies tense with the fear of being seen. For a moment I could not breathe. The world tilted as though the ground itself betrayed me. This was not suspicion, not a trick of imagination born of resentment. This was flesh and blood, undeniable, a betrayal unfolding in the very yard of my home. The woman my son trusted with his life, with his mother, was clutching at another man beneath the same roof. The air felt poisonous in my lungs, thick with the weight of their secret. I stepped back into the darkness, my hand pressed against the wall of the house to steady myself. Fury and grief battled in my chest, but over them rose something stronger, colder, certainty. The doubts I had nursed were gone, replaced by evidence that could not be ignored. They thought I was too frail to know, too blind to see, but my eyes had caught them in their moment of weakness. The house that Hannah treated as her stage had just revealed her as an actress caught mid-scene, and I, the audience she dismissed, now held the truth that would one day bring her to her knees. The morning after I saw Hannah with the gardener, I knew I could no longer rely on instinct alone. Secrets whispered in the garden could be denied, but money always told the truth. I contacted a licensed private investigator, a man whose reputation stretched through New Jersey courtrooms, someone who knew how to follow paper trails as well as shadows. Our meeting was arranged in quiet, away from the estate, and I told him only what was necessary. My voice never trembled. I wanted Hannah exposed, but I wanted it done by the law's hand, not mine. He began at once filing for access to public records, tracing the accounts tied to my household. Within days he had what I suspected, and worse. Dylan's deposits were being siphoned into Hannah's hands, but instead of stopping at the boutiques I already knew about, much of the money was withdrawn in cash. That cash flowed straight into a pawn establishment in Manhattan, a place infamous among collectors for dealing in fine art with questionable origins. The name was familiar to me from whispers in the world of insurance, a place where stolen canvases and smuggled porcelain often disappeared. The investigator placed a folder before me, photographs of receipts, stamped with the pawn shop's mark, dates that matched the days I had noticed objects missing from my gallery. My heart pounded as I recognized the description of a vase, an 18th century piece, almost identical to the one that had once stood in my hall. Another record listed a painting, its dimensions eerily close to the empty space on my wall. There it was in black and white, the link I had feared and yet needed. I closed the folder slowly, pressing my hand against it as if to keep my anger from spilling out. The affair with the gardener was a distraction, a reckless indulgence, but this was something darker. Hannah was not just faithless, she was ambitious, bold enough to bleed the estate while my son was away, bold enough to funnel heirlooms into the underground markets. The betrayal cut deeper because it was not passion that drove her, but greed, and greed was far more dangerous. I waited until the house was quiet before I summoned the old housekeeper. He had served this family for decades, a man who had seen me through grief and sickness, and who once carried trays of wine for my late husband's celebrations. When I asked him directly about the new gardener, his lips tightened. He gave the same careful shrug he always gave when Hannah was near, as if silence could shield him. But his eyes, heavy and tired, betrayed something else. They flickered toward the floor, toward the doors, as though he feared being overheard. I pressed gently, my voice low, reminding him of the years he had stood by me. At last, when the hallway was empty and no footsteps echoed above us, he exhaled like a man breaking under weight. In a whisper, he admitted what I had suspected. The old gardener, a man who had tended the roses for 15 years, had not left of his own will. He had been forced out. Hannah had declared him unsuitable, too slow, too old, and she insisted on hiring Edward in his place. The words trembled as they left his mouth, but the truth was steady. Hannah had not just stumbled into an affair, she had cleared the way for it. It was more than romance, more than betrayal of vows, it was strategy. She had brought her lover into the estate, under my roof, and given him keys to the grounds. With Edward at her side, she had an accomplice to help move boxes, to shift paintings, to carry porcelain out of the house at night. What vanished from the gallery had not vanished by chance. It had been escorted out the door by hands that should have been pruning hedges and cutting grass. I felt the chill settle deep into my bones, colder than the night air outside. This was no longer just a home of silence and secrets. It was a stage where Hannah had cast herself as the mistress, her lover as the servant, and the rest of us as unwilling actors. The walls that once sheltered me now echoed with betrayal, and the rooms that once carried laughter now hid conspiracies. For the first time since my stroke, I realized the danger was not only in the shadows. It was walking openly in daylight, holding the keys to my garden, and smiling at my son while plotting in my halls. I sat in the quiet of my study, the air heavy with the scent of old leather and cedar, and I let the pieces arrange themselves in my mind. What I had witnessed in the garden, what the housekeeper had confessed in whispers, and what the investigators' files had confirmed were no longer fragments. They were a design, sharp and deliberate, drawn by Hannah's greedy hand. This was not just a young wife betraying her vows. This was a plan, carefully set, to seize and bleed a fortune my husband had built over a lifetime. The missing vases and paintings were not accidents. They were the opening moves in a theft worth millions. I saw it clearly now. The affair was not a distraction, but a tool. It bound Hannah and Edward together with a secret that made them reckless, made them loyal to each other above all else. And the gardener's sudden arrival, replacing the man who had served faithfully for 15 years, was no coincidence. It was a strategic maneuver. She had placed her accomplice within the walls, where he could move freely, carry boxes, and shield her crimes under the cover of honest labor. Together, they had turned my sanctuary into their hunting ground. The temptation to confront her rose hot in my throat. I imagined standing in the grand hall, forcing her to look at the empty pedestals and the pale marks on the walls, demanding answers. But anger was not enough. If I accused her now, she would twist the story, shed tears before Dylan, and paint me as a paranoid, fragile old woman. No, I had learned from years of marriage, of business, of surviving loss, that patience can cut deeper than rage. I would wait, and while I waited, I would watch. So I let the mask of weakness remain. I leaned heavier on my cane. I let my hand tremble at the dinner table. I closed my eyes as if too tired to see her triumph. Behind the mask I recorded, I gathered, I counted every penny and every box. I was no longer a mother merely wounded by betrayal. I was a guardian of a fortune, and I was preparing for war. The stage had shifted, no longer a family drama, but a battlefield of law, finance, and proof. And when the curtain rose, it would not be my reputation that burned, it would be hers. I began with the cameras, the silent witnesses that had watched Hannah parade through my halls in glittering gowns while I pretended to sleep. Each file was carefully downloaded and stored, every clip stamped with time and date, leaving no room for denial. There she was, stepping through the grand doors at 3 in the morning, arms laden with shopping bags. And there was Edward, slipping through the gate under cover of night, his posture tense, his eyes sweeping the grounds as if he knew he did not belong. The footage painted a portrait more damning than words could ever reach. The private investigator was just as thorough. A new folder arrived on my desk, photographs printed and clipped, each one a nail in the coffin Hannah was building for herself. There she was outside a pawn shop in Manhattan, her scarf drawn low, handing over a thick envelope of cash. Another shot caught her speaking to a clerk in front of a display of antique porcelain, the man's hand reaching for the envelope she held. The images did not just confirm my suspicions. They connected the missing vases and paintings directly to her hands, to her greed. I ordered a full inventory of the estate's collection. Room by room, piece by piece, we compared what remained against the insurance schedules my husband and I had so carefully maintained. The gaps were undeniable. A painting here, a vase there, each one worth tens or hundreds of thousands. When the final tally was done, the losses stretched into millions. It was no longer the grief of a widow watching her treasures fade. It was theft, calculated and deliberate, capable of standing in any courtroom. As I sat before the evidence, I felt the weight shift. For months I had been the victim, silenced and mocked in my own home, but now the balance was changing. These documents, these recordings, these photographs were not just scraps of paper. They were weapons, each one honed by legality and truth, ready to be placed before lawyers, judges, and my son. I had enough now to cut through Hannah's mask of sweetness, to strip away her lies. The house no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a fortress. And I held the keys. The next folder the investigator handed me was heavier than the rest, thick with receipts and account statements that smelled of ink and betrayal. I spread them across my desk, my fingers tracing the lines like a surgeon exposing a wound. There it was in black and white, a Swiss watch valued at 6 figures, purchased with Dylan's card, delivered under Hannah's name. Next, a handbag listed as limited edition, one of only a dozen in the world, charged to the same account. And then the most damning page of all, a sleek European car, registered to Edward the gardener, but paid for entirely from Dylan's funds. Every document carried the clarity of numbers that could not lie. The statements listed card numbers, dates, and transaction codes, each one a record of how Hannah had drained the lifeblood of my son's earnings. It was no longer just indulgence, no longer late-night gowns and perfumes. This was theft cloaked as marriage, the siphoning of wealth from husband to wife, and then from wife to lover. In American law, the phrase came to me like a sharp blade: marital waste. It is what courts call the reckless destruction of marital assets, the spending of shared funds for purposes that betray the marriage itself. These receipts were more than proof of greed. They were grounds. Grounds for divorce, grounds for recovery, grounds to strip Hannah of every advantage she thought she had secured. I sat back, my pulse steady now, my fury cooled into something far more dangerous. For months she believed she was untouchable, protected by Dylan's blind devotion. But numbers do not weep, they do not charm, they do not lie. They are cold, they are final, and they speak louder than the prettiest words. Hannah had not only betrayed her vows, she had funded her lover with my son's money, carved out his luxuries from Dylan's trust. It was the twist I needed, the crack that would widen into a chasm. Hannah thought she was clever, but the trail she left was a confession in ink. And when the time came, those pages would not only end her marriage, they would end her illusion of power. I arranged the meeting in the back office of a law firm in Newark, a place Hannah would never think to look. My attorney greeted me with quiet respect, already familiar with the long history of the estate. Together we opened the thick file that held my husband's will and the family trust, documents that had once been symbols of comfort but now stood as battlegrounds. With steady hands I signed the papers that created a new addendum, one that shifted every remaining piece of art, every insured antique, into a dynasty trust. Dylan's name was written clearly as the sole beneficiary, his inheritance locked beyond dispute. And most important of all, the clause that excluded Hannah entirely, binding her fate with conditions she could not escape. The lawyer explained each line with calm precision. If Hannah pursued divorce, she would be entitled to nothing from this trust. If evidence of criminal activity or financial abuse was proven, her access to any marital assets could be challenged and removed. It was not vengeance scribbled in anger, but law forged into armor. I thought of Dylan, my son, still blind to the schemes swirling inside his home. One day he would see Hannah's true face, and when that day came, the fortress would already be in place. She could weep, she could rage, she could try to twist the story, but the trust would not bend. The dynasty trust would guard the estate as fiercely as I once guarded his childhood. As I laid down the pen, the weight of the decision settled over me. This was no longer a private feud between two women under the same roof. It was a war fought with contracts, with clauses, with signatures that would stand in court. My grief had sharpened into strategy. Hannah thought she was clever, but she had underestimated what 60 years of living, of loss, and of survival had taught me. I was not just a mother defending her pride. I was a strategist, protecting her legacy. I called Dylan home under the pretense of urgency, my voice steady but edged with something he had never heard from me before. When he arrived, his eyes were tired from travel, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his company. Yet I saw the boy he once was flicker through when I told him there was something he needed to know. I laid the evidence before him, the folders from the investigator, the photographs, the bank statements, and the clips from the cameras. He turned each page with a silence that grew darker by the minute. When the video of Hannah walking in at 3 in the morning filled the screen, arms full of shopping bags, he pressed his palm against his forehead and whispered a single word: God. By the time I showed him the registration of the car in Edward's name, he no longer spoke. His trust was cracking, his belief in her falling away piece by piece. We sat together at the heavy oak desk, mother and son, allies in a war that had come to our doorstep. I told him the plan, speaking in the calm tone I once used in business meetings with his father. We would announce a short trip, a weekend at a resort, make the house seem empty, unguarded. Hannah would hear the words, and her own ambition would do the rest. Dylan listened, then nodded, a man swallowing betrayal but clinging to resolve. He wanted proof beyond doubt, something no tears could wash away. Before we staged our departure, Dylan inspected the security system himself. He adjusted the settings, ensured every lens was clean, every microphone clear, and every angle covered. The living room, the grand hallway, the staircase leading to the bedrooms, all of it would capture what Hannah and Edward believed was private. There would be no question of legality, no crack for her to slip through later. This was not vengeance in shadows. It was truth caught in light. I watched Dylan's face as he worked. Pain lived there, but so did determination. For the first time in months, I felt him beside me, not distant and blind, but awake, sharp, ready to defend what was his and mine. We were no longer mother and son separated by lies. We were partners in a carefully laid trap, and as the pieces slid into place, I realized that the strength I had pretended to lose had returned, multiplied by the unity of blood and truth. Hannah thought she had turned my home into her stage, but now she was walking straight into the final act we had written for her. That very night, as though fate could not resist revealing its hand, Hannah moved quickly. Dylan and I had only just left in the car, circling the block to keep up the illusion, when the cameras came alive with motion. I watched from the hidden monitor as she opened the front door, not with caution, but with the ease of someone welcoming family. Edward stepped inside, his jacket slung over his shoulder, and she kissed his cheek as if the house already belonged to them. My hands clenched around the arm of my chair, yet I forced myself to stay still. The trap was working. In the living room, they poured glasses of wine, laughter bubbling up as if my walls had been built for their pleasure. Hannah leaned against him, her head tilted back, her smile smug. They clinked their glasses together and then abandoned them half full on the marble table as Edward pulled her into his arms. The kiss was long, careless, the kind of intimacy that only exists when two people are certain no one is watching. My stomach turned, but my mind stayed cold. This was not betrayal whispered in shadows. This was betrayal flaunted in daylight, captured in high definition. When they finally pulled apart, Hannah took his hand and led him toward the staircase. Side by side, their bodies pressed close, they ascended the steps like newlyweds climbing into their honeymoon suite. And where did they go? Straight into the master bedroom, the room that bore Dylan's name, the marriage bed they had shared. I felt Dylan beside me stiffen, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the screen. For him, the truth was no longer something his mother had told him. It was playing out minute by minute right before his eyes. The cameras caught everything. The kisses on the stairs, the way she pulled Edward's tie loose with a playful tug, the way his hand slid across her back as she opened the bedroom door. The lens in the hallway captured the last image before the door closed. Hannah, laughing, her arms locked around the man who was not her husband. No excuses could cover this, no tears could undo it. Their secret was no longer a secret. The timing had to be perfect. Dylan and I pushed open the heavy doors of the mansion just as Hannah and Edward disappeared into the master bedroom upstairs. Dylan deliberately let the door slam behind us, the echo rolling through the halls like thunder. I heard the shuffle of footsteps above. A gasp carried faintly through the air. They had heard us, and panic had already begun. Dylan's face was stone as he strode into the living room, picked up the remote, and with one sharp click, brought the truth to life on the wide screen mounted above the fireplace. The room lit up with images from just minutes before. Hannah laughing in her sequined dress, her arms looped around Edward's neck, his hands firm on her waist. The sound was clear, too, the clink of glasses, the whispers, the breathless giggle that Hannah could never deny was hers. For a moment the house itself seemed to hold its breath. Then came the hurried thuds from the stairs. They stumbled into the living room, both pale as ghosts. Hannah froze first, her eyes wide as they landed on her own image displayed larger than life. For one long heartbeat she said nothing, her lips trembling. Then the dam broke. She fell to her knees, hands outstretched, her voice cracking into desperate pleas. She begged Dylan to listen, to understand, to forgive. But the screen kept rolling, showing her pulling Edward's tie loose, showing the smirk on her face that betrayed every word of denial. Edward stood rigid, color draining from his face. His jaw clenched, but no words came. He glanced at Hannah, then at Dylan, then back at the damning images on the screen. His silence was worse than her screaming. It was the silence of a man caught with no exit. I looked at my son, standing tall, shoulders squared, no longer blind. The betrayal was no longer whispers in a mother's ear. It was undeniable, vivid, cruel in its clarity. And it unfolded right there, in the room where Hannah had once played the sweet wife. There would be no lies left, no excuses, no escape. Dylan did not raise his voice, did not even glance at Hannah as she wept on the floor. He simply lifted one hand, pointed toward the screen where her own laughter and kisses replayed in cruel clarity, and said with the weight of finality, "This marriage is over." His words cut sharper than any shouting could. Hannah froze, her sobs catching in her throat as if the air had been stolen from the room. I stood beside my son, my cane steady in my grip, my eyes locked on Hannah. My voice was low, measured, but it carried an edge that left no doubt. Every second of what you see here is preserved. The files are secured. Our lawyer holds the entire record. Her face collapsed into shock, the realization dawning that there would be no chance to twist this, no stage to perform her lies. Edward shifted, trying to step back toward the door, but Dylan's voice stopped him cold. "Do not move." I reminded him calmly that the cameras had captured his presence, his intimacy, his role in this deception. "The police will be contacted," I said, each syllable deliberate. "You will answer for every part you played." His eyes dropped, his defiance draining into silence. The room was heavy with exposure. Hannah's mask, so carefully worn before friends and family, was gone. No gentle daughter-in-law remained, only a woman stripped bare by her own greed, revealed as a thief of trust, of money, of vows. She covered her face with trembling hands, but it did not matter. The truth was already etched in digital ink, replaying again and again, undeniable. And so it ended, not with screams or violence, but with silence and ruin. Dylan turned away, his back straight, his choice final. I followed, every step certain, leaving Hannah on the marble floor to face the wreckage of her own making. The curtain had fallen, and the role she had crafted so carefully had been torn away forever. The week that followed was marked not by whispers, but by the firm sound of justice being set in motion. Dylan walked into the county courthouse with his lawyer at his side, the petition for divorce already prepared. The filing was straightforward, citing two grounds recognized under American law: adultery, supported by irrefutable video evidence, and marital waste, proven by the receipts and bank records showing Hannah had drained marital funds to finance Edward's luxuries. The judge's clerk accepted the documents, and with the stamp of the court seal, the marriage that Hannah had once paraded as her triumph was now publicly collapsing. In the legal framework of the United States, such evidence is more than enough to tilt the balance. A spouse who can show both infidelity and misuse of marital property is positioned to receive the lion's share of protections and assets. Hannah's carefully constructed image of a devoted wife crumbled the moment those words appeared in black and white on the petition. She was no longer shielded as a legal wife entitled to equal division. She stood exposed, facing not only the loss of property, but the looming possibility of restitution. For Dylan, this was more than a personal break. It was the reclaiming of his dignity, the severing of chains that had bound him to betrayal. For me, it was the vindication of patience, of strategy, of trusting that truth, once armed with law, would do the work emotion could not. Hannah's cries of devotion, her staged photographs, her sweet words meant for neighbors and friends, none of it could stand against the cold clarity of the court filings. As the news of the divorce filing rippled quietly through our circles, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The law had taken hold, steady and impartial, and it was not Hannah's tears but her deeds that spoke now. She had thought wealth would bend to her charm, that status could be secured by deception. But in the end, the system itself became the stage where her downfall was read aloud. The legal blow that followed was heavier than the divorce itself. Our attorney compiled a dossier thick enough to fill a banker's box, each page a piece of the trap Hannah had walked into. The catalog of missing items was exhaustive. 19th century European oil paintings, 18th century Asian porcelain vases, jeweled inlay furniture, all matched against the insurance records and photographs my late husband and I had kept so carefully. Alongside it lay the receipts of pawn shops, the photographs taken by the private investigator, and the bank statements that traced the money trail directly to Hannah's hands. With these, the civil complaint was filed in the county court, accusing her of theft, fraud, and wrongful conversion of property worth millions. In the United States, such an action does not stand alone. Civil liability intertwines with criminal exposure. By pawning or selling insured artwork, Hannah had stepped into the territory of insurance fraud, a crime that carries weight beyond financial loss. If prosecutors chose to pursue, she could face not only restitution, but prison time. The complaint spelled it out plainly. She had no consent, no authority, and no legal shield. What she called borrowing was, in the eyes of the law, stealing. The day she received the summons, there was no hiding. Process servers delivered it at the mansion gates, the bold letters of the court demanding her appearance. Neighbors watched from their driveways as she took the papers with trembling hands. The image of the perfect wife, the graceful hostess, shattered in public view. No more tears behind closed doors, no staged photographs of care and devotion. Now she was a defendant, accused by name, bound by law to answer. I watched from the window, not with triumph, but with a steady calm. For months she had played her game within these walls, believing herself untouchable. But every lie leaves a trail, and every trail, once gathered, becomes a chain. She had chained herself to this moment. And when she stood before the court, with judges and lawyers weighing her every word, there would be no mask left to wear. Only the truth, sharp and merciless, would remain. The court's preliminary ruling came swift and clear, a document stamped with authority that stripped away the last of Hannah's pretenses. She was ordered to return every stolen artifact or provide compensation equal to their insured value. The list was long, stretching across pages, each item accompanied by the appraiser's figures. Millions of dollars stood between her and freedom. For a moment she dared to hope she could retrieve the pieces, but the reality was harsher. Most of the vases and paintings had already been sold off through the art pawn shop, passed into private hands that would never return them. The law did not bend for her convenience. If the items could not be recovered, she would have to pay. That meant not with Dylan's money, not with family trust funds already secured beyond her reach, but with her own assets. Her car, her jewelry, her bank accounts, even her personal credit. Everything she had used to build her facade of glamour would now be the currency of her undoing. With every signature, every judgment, the image she built of wealth collapsed into dust. The attorney's explanation was merciless but simple. When you exploit marital funds for personal gain and commit theft, you don't just lose the marriage, you inherit the debt. Hannah's eyes widened as she realized what bankruptcy meant in America. No more designer gowns, no more private dinners at exclusive clubs, no more illusion of control. She would be forced to sell, to liquidate, to hand over every luxury she had flaunted on social media as proof of her triumph. I sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, watching her shoulders slump under the verdict. Edward was the first to feel the grip of justice. Police officers escorted him from the pawn shop where he had once smirked while trading porcelain for cash. Now he sat under harsh lights in an interrogation room, confronted with receipts, surveillance stills, and witness statements. He tried to deny at first, but the evidence piled higher than his excuses. His role as Hannah's accomplice was undeniable. He had carried stolen antiques, driven them across state lines, and benefited from money that was never his. What began as whispered passion in a garden shed now ended in a police file stamped with his name. The scandal burst into public view as if the town had been waiting for the fire. Headlines screamed from the front page of the local paper: Heiress family scandal, daughter-in-law caught in affair and art theft. The story spread online, each share a nail in the coffin of Hannah's reputation. Talk shows dissected the details, legal analysts weighed in on marital waste and insurance fraud, and neighbors who once envied her gowns now shook their heads at the photographs splashed across the news. Those photographs became iconic in their own cruel way. Hannah, draped in a designer dress, her once proud stride reduced to a stumble, her hand raised to shield her face from the cameras. No jewelry, no practiced smile, no power left to command the narrative. The image circulated faster than any lie she had ever told, and for the first time, the world saw her not as a wife of privilege, but as a woman branded by greed and betrayal. I watched the coverage from my study, the television's glow reflecting off the polished wood of the desk where my husband once worked. I felt no joy, only a sense of finality. Karma had arrived, swift and merciless, leaving Hannah with nothing but ashes of her ambition. She had lost Dylan, she had lost the fortune she schemed for, and now, worst of all, she had lost her name. Reputation is the currency no court can restore, and hers was gone forever. For me, that was the truest form of justice.